I guess we'll go first to Matt here, and I guess HP did a little bit of a study looking at, we've been talking a lot about the Internet of Things or the Internet of Insecure Things. So what can you tell us about their findings?
Sure. So HP released a report, sort of a state of the Internet of Things report, and their numbers state that about 70% of the top most popular Internet of Things devices had some form of vulnerability, password vulnerabilities and things like that. Their methodology is a little interesting in my opinion. They took the top 10 devices, judged by whatever criteria they had, in a number of different arenas of Internet of Things type devices, and they actually took them to the workbench and gave them, well, the works, I guess you could call it. Tried to look at the web interfaces to them, watch the traffic going in and out of them. If they had cloud components, tried to audit whether or not credentials are being sent in the clear or not, the whole gamut. I find it interesting that they're throwing numbers around like 70% when they have a sample size of only 10, but I also understand that doing a penetration test, and it is a penetration test on devices like these, does take a lot of time. I would have liked to see a larger sample set and maybe some of the less popular devices in there as well. They didn't state which devices they chose, but if you take a look at their article, they mentioned 10 different categories and they tested 10 different devices. So if you happen to know a little bit about each field, like smart thermostats, for example, you could probably pick out which devices they most likely tested.
Right. So I'm actually a little surprised. I think you were a little skeptical about the 70 numbers. Why not 100? I mean, I would tend to think that 100% of them probably have some sort of vulnerabilities. Now, the question is, do we know about it? Has it been exposed yet? But did they happen to talk about what types of tests did they? You mentioned the authentication, things like that. But we've seen certainly a lot of cases where they're responding to DNS, for example, and shouldn't be, or NTP, or other services that have been used in reflection attack activity. Would they consider that to be a vulnerability?
The ones they listed here are privacy concerns. If credentials are being sent insecurely back home, if there's some sort of unique device identifier that's being sent back home as well. Insufficient authorization, which is whether or not they've got a real password policy. If the device prevents you from setting a 4-character password, sort of protecting against the user's own mistakes. Lack of transport encryption, so if they're not using SSL when they call home or when you talk to the web interface. Insecure web interface, so the entire gamut of web application security problems there. And then inadequate software protection, which is updates to the firmware if they're not encrypted and protected on the way in and out, which allows someone to grab them, unpack them completely, make modifications, and re-upload insecure firmware. So they did a lot of testing, it seems.
Yeah, it sounds like a good repertoire. I guess a couple of things that still hit my pet peeve list. In fact, I have a list of perhaps 5 things that any Internet of Thing or network connected device should have. One is that the notion of default password, I think, needs to evaporate. That is, at least have it tied to a serial number or something so that you have to guess a lot harder to be able to get to it. And then the second, ideally, you'd have actually a random password that's, if you lose it, you go back to the registration, or it's printed on a sticker or something on it, so that you have to physically have the device to know. And then the second one would be updates. Software updates need to be very simple. The notion of download a file, put it here, upload it there, turn it off, reset, pray. It just doesn't really make sense to me. So it doesn't sound like they addressed those 2 topics.
No.
Is that right?
It seems like they were going for a wide swath. They may have hit individual ones, but it's not listed here. But one thing I did want to bring up that I thought was interesting is that one of the authors of the study actually worked with the OWASP group, the Open Web Application Security Project, who is known for their top 10 OWASP vulnerabilities lists. They now have a top 10 vulnerabilities for the Internet of Things list, which I think will go a long way in convincing producers of these kind of devices to make these sorts of changes in their products.
Okay, good. So there's vulnerabilities per se, and it sounds like that was sort of the focus of their study. And but in order to make things more secure, it's more than just fixing vulnerabilities. And I think, for example, being able to update the software easily is an opportunity to be able to fix a vulnerability that's discovered perhaps later in the life cycle of the device. So very interesting. I think it's encouraging that folks are starting to pay attention to this, and we'll be able to proceed forward. make some
my
progress.
observation of it is there's a little bit of a twofold angle here. Like you said, some of the authentication mechanisms are not very good, but then I think there's also a lot of cases where users are making bad choices on how to set up and deploy these devices in their network. So they drop these, particularly with the security camera DVR systems, we know they just drop them in. They go to their firewall, they say, let me make this a DMZ device so anything on the outside can get into it, because it's too complicated for me to figure out how to do port forwarding or whatever. I don't know what their issue is there, but they open all the ports up, Telnet, SSH, the web interface, everything, so that anybody on the outside who's scanning could potentially find it and get into it at some point.
Yeah,
so
absolutely.
Well, a lot of these devices, they actually are made to be very user-friendly from a certain perspective. That's the initial configuration and working out. But then the user would never know, for example, if there's a debug port that's opened on it, or that there even was a need to have an update.
Right.
Yeah,
So that's what I said. It's kind of a twofold. The user kind of making a bad choice on how to expose it to the internet, but then they don't have the insight. It's the vendor's fault for opening and exposing all these ports that probably the users are not aware are open on it.
Right.
But the bad guys
an
are.
individual consumer shouldn't have to do a security assessment of a device they buy off the shelf. So, all right. Well, like I said, I think it's encouraging that some folks are starting to pay attention to this. Now, I think hopefully in the future they'll get a little more specific in terms of the reporting about, and perhaps maybe they're working with the vendors about these vulnerabilities so that they're not exposed prior to having fix opportunities for those vendors. So that's a good thing, absolutely.